We as humans have always wondered if we could create the perfect world, free of violence, greed, and sadness. The question is, can this so-called perfect world exist in society? A utopian can be defined as any visionary system of political or social perfection, or an ideal place or state. The first use of the word utopia was used by Sir Thomas More in 1516. The word utopia is Greek in origin, autopos, meaning no place or nowhere. This of course was a play on words, on the most identical Greek word, entopos, meaning a good place. I will be talking about Thomas More later in this video. I first want to look into the concept of a utopian society. So where is a utopia? When you look at utopias in general, a lot of them are located outside time, and is more into a mythic type of realm. There are a time after death and before time began. A lot of these utopian visions are just fantasy, and are just to escape everyday life. An example is 1950s sci-fi movies and books that explore the world of the future. Another question is, what is a utopian made of? Visions of utopian societies mostly include similar versions of social structures and common traditions that existed in the world at a time of creation of the utopian myth. They basically had systems of justice, economy, control, and form of law, and custom and belief to support their own vision. Utopian societies usually parallel the world around them. The utopia is a parallel, but it is a perfected version of the world. This is the interesting thing. By seeing the contrast between the real world and the mythical world, the differences can be noticed. These differences can also reflect the problems going around at the time that people wanted to fix. Therefore, they wanted to see if a perfect society could be built to fix them. I've talked a little about mythical utopias. Now I'm going to give you some examples. The first example is a very old mythical tale from the book of Genesis in the Bible, the Garden of Eden. The story of creation is the opening chapter of the Bible. It is one of the earliest descriptions of the perfect paradise. The Garden of Eden is unmarked in history and is set outside time and shows a golden age before things went wrong. Something interesting is the fact it had a system of hierarchy and that God chose humans to rule over the other animals. This is a common theme in utopian societies. Another interesting depiction of fantasy is Plato's book The Republic, in which he describes three elements of man. Plato was a Greek philosopher who lived between 427 and 347 BC. Plato's idea was to divide the general population into three classes: reason, appetite, and spirit. The statesmen that ran the government, they were the philosophers, and they were governed by reason. The civilians, they provided the majority of the material needs. They were governed by appetite and pleasure. Lastly was the executive force, and they were the soldiers and policemen, and they were governed by spirit and action. This division makes it on the basis of state-provided education, which is not by birth or wealth. Everyone in society is assigned a rank best suited to them by a process of examination. In a perfect state, everyone plays their own part and keeps within the guidelines and boundaries. Here are the three elements that every individual who is governed must abide by. Rational judgment of what is good. A mass of conflicting appetites for particular gratifications. Spirit or will, which seeks to prevent infringements of rights by other people and by the individual's own appetites. When people are ruled by reason and society is ruled by philosophers, that is when true harmony can be achieved. A society ruled by the best is an aristocracy. Plato thought that aristocracy was to be preferred over a democracy ruled by the mob, plutocracy ruled by the rich, and so on. Now, seeing that we don't have philosophers ruling over the government nowadays, it is safe to say that the people did not agree with Plato. These types of utopias are fantasy because they all rely on the people working at their best possible ability, with no failures in between. And if we know human nature, not everyone can do that. These mythical utopias are what people could only dream of, but that begs the question, have there been actual utopias tested, and have they worked out? If we look back in history, there were definitely attempted takes on a perfect society, but they all seem to come to the same result. If we look at Brook Farm, formerly the Brook Farm Institute of Agriculture and Education, it was a very short example of a utopian experiment in communal living in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. It was founded in the 1840s by George Ripley, and its main goal was to create a living condition where people could share a workload so that everyone could spend time doing what they want. But in the end, it was just a dream that was too good to be true. The philosophy at the Brook Farm was based on the writings and work of the French utopian socialist Charles Fourier. The residents at Brook Farm believed that the key to happiness was manual labor. They thought they would be able to unite all social classes to offer each person a level of individual freedom. Now where have we heard that from? Brook Farm did grow at first, but the land was poorly chosen. Even when they expanded with homes, community centers, a schoolhouse, and greenhouses, the Brook farmers still struggled to turn a profit they needed so desperately. In 1844, the Brook Farm community was restructured, but even then, debts continued to rise, and this resulted in lack of food. What made things worse is that smallpox broke out in 1846. George Ripley eventually left the community. Now the only thing that stands is the print shop. It is what's left of George Ripley's failed utopian experiment. What we've seen with Brook Farm was a short-lived utopian experiment. Now I'm going to talk about another utopian society, the Shakers, or the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearance. They are an example of one of the most successful utopian communities. The Shakers have kept a distinct set of rules that kept them around in the United States for over 200 years. Unlike a lot of failed utopias that set a lot of different rules, the Shakers had very simple ones. The Shakers were founded in England in 1770 by Anne Lee. Anne Lee was tired of the Anglican Church and had problems with giving birth to 4 children, all of which died in childbirth. After the death of the 4th child, Anne Lee claimed to have seen a vision from God, that she says she learned that celibacy was the way to go, and that all sexual intercourse was a sin. Her followers at some point started to call her Mother Anne because they believed that she was the female component of Christ's spirit, and that she was the second coming of Christ. In 1772, Anne supposedly saw another vision from God, and that there was a place being prepared for the Shakers in America. In 1774, 9 Shakers immigrated to America, in which they lived in New York, until they had the money to move to the area of wilderness in the western New York state, Niskayuna. This is where they built their first communities in the U.S. In time, the communities expanded to 18, which stretched from Kentucky to Maine. As for the basic rules, which were from Anne Lee's visions, they had to live by 4 basic rules. The first rule was they had to live communally. The second rule was they had to be celibate. The third rule was they had to regularly confess any sins. And the last rule was they had to separate themselves from the outside world. Mother Anne believed that every member had a duty to work. Men and women were separated into different activities, and even after Anne Lee's death, she was succeeded by both male and female leaders. The Shakers fit the utopian guidelines, and believed they would be rewarded by continuing to work hard and follow the rules. They celebrated celibacy and needed outsiders to keep the population growing. There are less than a dozen members remaining. In 1850, they numbered at almost 4,000 members, and had been around for around 200 plus years. The Shakers may be considered a successful utopian society at first glance, but it isn't entirely true. A utopia is a perfect society, and the Shakers were a cult, blinded and manipulated, and stuck in a bubble that had no idea of the outside world. If they knew what the outside world could bring, the so-called utopia would fall apart almost instantly. We can see that even now. They are at their last remaining members. Once they are gone, it's all over. What we have found out so far is that most utopian societies fall flat because they hide from the real world. Now that leads us back to the 16th century about Sir Thomas More, who wrote the first formal utopia. Sir Thomas More dreamed of a complex society that was self-sufficient on an island, in which communities shared a common goal. He defined systems of social hierarchy, agriculture, education, and forms of punishment. But after learning the different types of utopias, mythical fantasies, and utopian experiments, it becomes more obvious that Sir Thomas More's utopia doesn't belong in the real world. To think a perfect world could just sit in a bubble without outside interaction is just fantasy. Most utopian societies share common problems, in that they always picture the absolute perfect people to live in that society. If we know human nature, it becomes apparent that humans are not perfect, so even if you had the perfect society, humans' greed and the fight to be better than other people would surely be the downfall of the utopia. Even looking at the most recent utopian societies, we can see they relied on a type of socialism, and how everyone is a part of a collective community. Here is the problem with that, and I'll use this as an example. Say a utopian society is running out of farmers, and that they need to keep up with the demand of growing more crops for the community. They can't force people that don't want to be farmers, because that would be the next step in socialism, the bridge to communism. As well as they can't pay the farmers more to encourage people to join, because then people from other jobs would want to raise as well. That is why socialism and communism cannot work in society, because people being people is what makes those utopian societies crash and burn. It isn't to say a utopian society could exist in the future, but there is a difference of a perfect world and a world that looks perfect. Just like the Shakers' Utopia, which was a cult, they thought they were living their lives to the absolute fullest, but it was all a lie. That is to show how powerful cult mentality is. As it stands, there has never been a perfect world made by humans, and there probably never will. The closest we've ever gotten was people being brainwashed into believing they lived in a perfect world. In knowing all that, it doesn't stop the SJWs from thinking that they can make the perfect world using political correctness, even though humans are the flaw in a perfect world utopian concept. SJW's main solution to the problem is to silence everyone that disagrees and pretend that they don't exist. Using labels and hundreds of genders, talking about the individual, and then in favor of a system like communism that is in favor of mindless workers, believing they are working for their people, but are instead working for the interests of the rich. Communism is a trick, and it seems the SJWs will not understand that. Just a hypothetical, even if the SJWs create a utopia using political correctness, what is stopping them from cannibalizing themselves? Since they see the importance in how many victim points you have, rather than who you are as a person, that would cause conflict, and we have seen that radical feminism is eating itself. That is because other feminists argue that white feminists are not true feminists, because they haven't experienced what it's like to be a non-privileged. See, it is all about being a victim than actually helping society. That is funny. How could radical feminists disagree with each other when they believe in the same concepts? The biggest threat to a political correct utopia would be the SJWs themselves. They only like to point out flaws rather than to actually look for solutions. So how would a utopia comprised of SJWs exist in the first place? For SJWs, history is most definitely not on their side. They think they can just repeat communism again and expect a different result. And as we all know, that is the definition of insanity. When you look into how to do an experiment, you always start small scale. And yet again, we see the SJWs skipping that very step. They fail to realize that if political correctness is used on a big scale without proper testing, it could cause a greater threat to society, and that is what we have been seeing for the last couple of years. If the SJWs wanted to prove to society that political correctness is more perfect over all other systems, show it working in a small-scale utopian society. But seeing the reoccurrence of history, I doubt you would get very far. The idea of political correctness is very unstable, and it would eventually collapse under its own weight. Utopias are not the perfect world. They are only an illusion. As long as humans don't think as one mind, it is almost impossible. And looking back at the examples of failed utopias in history, it further proves that the perfect world is just a fantasy. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the content, like and subscribe. Here's my question. Do you think there's a way to make the perfect world? Let me know in the comment section below, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next video.